This edition of Independent Sources, a special series in the run-up to the presidential election, continues with a look at who votes in the city's ethnic and immigrant communities and how they're growing their political power.
Independent Sources, your window to the city's ethnic and immigrant communities. Here's your host, Garry Pierre-Pierre.
Voter turnout in New York City has been a persistent problem. During the 2009 mayoral election, fewer than 1 in 5 eligible voters cast a ballot. That percentage dipped further in tracts where there were large numbers of naturalized immigrant voters. With me to discuss whether this is the real narrative of ethnic and immigrant voters are Queens College sociology professor Dr. Andrew Beveridge, an assistant professor of public policy at John Jay, Dr. Heath Brown. Dr. Brown is also the author of the book Immigrants and Electoral Politics, Nonprofit Organizing in a Time of Demographic Change. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks very much, Gary.
Our first question goes straight to this 2010 U.S. Census, and it found that 1/3 less of New York City's eligible citizens turn out to vote. The percentage is even lower amongst naturalized citizens. Why is that?
You know, I think that one of the things that we know is people vote when they're asked to vote. And unfortunately, people don't get asked to vote very often. And if you live in a state that is not in a competitive election, and you're in a community that the parties don't typically rely on to turn out, you're not going to get a phone call, you're not going to get a letter in the mail, you're not going to be asked to participate. It's one of the biggest reasons why people simply don't participate, which is they're not asked to participate. There are other reasons, but I think this is a big part of it, especially when we look at a national election like this, living in New York, where it's unlikely you're going to see one of those ads on TV. If you were living in Ohio or Florida or Pennsylvania, you would
These are the swing states.
Absolutely, and you'd be inundated with phone calls and television advertising. In New York, we can all notice that we don't see as much of it. I think it's one of the reasons why we see these kinds of differences in turnout.
Dr. Beveridge, despite that reality, what should the political parties be doing to reach out to immigrant and other voters?
Well, I think the first point, which I completely agree with you, that if you go to a swing state during the season, it's just unbelievable what you see on TV. I mean, it's like nothing you would see here. However, the irony of it is that in New York State, which is really a strongly blue state, I mean, there's no two ways about it, generally speaking, there's a much higher turnout in presidential years, even in New York State, than there is in congressional years. And if you go to the mayoral elections, to the off-year elections, it's tiny. I mean, the percentage of turnout against potential people who could vote is something on the order of 20, as you were saying, it's like 20%. And so you have a situation where and then the immigrant groups are even, are even less. And I think one of the things that people have found is that if they have a candidate that's a candidate of their choice, there's what's called warming. In other words, if there's a Hispanic candidate running in a district that could potentially return a Hispanic candidate, the turnout rate goes way up, or could potentially go way up. However, it's kind of an irony, because on the one hand, ethnicity is a very good way to mobilize, people to vote for you. And in fact, were some examples recently where, the Dominicans versus the other Hispanic groups up in the Upper Manhattan, with the congressional primary. Sure. But at the same time, it often takes drawing a broad coalition, going across groups to really win. And so you have a funny situation in New York, because New York has so many different, both ethnic and immigrant groups, that it's actually kind of it's a kind of a patchwork or a crazy quilt thing, and it's very, it takes a lot. I mean, John Liu, who's no longer in office, immediately joined the Black Coalition and the Hispanic Coalition when he became a member of the City Council, and they said to him, well, why? And he says, well, where's the Asian coalition? He was the only Asian on the city council at the time. And then Meng, who won in Queens, the congressional seat, she won with that district has about 30% Asian, and she was very good at pulling across and getting people from other groups. So it's a very tricky business to run as an ethnic candidate. You can't be too ethnic, but you still have to keep your ethnic groups together.
Sure, that's a very valid point. But at the same time, Dr. Brown, who vote and who doesn't?
What we see consistently of late is that if we compare those with Caucasian, African American, Hispanic Latinos, and Asian Americans, we see the turnout in most elections among African Americans and white Americans significantly higher than for Hispanic Latinos and Asian Americans. There's this gap that has persisted, and part of that gap is related to the institutions that increase the likelihood of people voting. Voting is also such as community-based organizations, local nonprofit organizations that for some communities have decades of experience getting out the vote. So in the African American community, there is a long history that didn't just start in the civil rights movement, but even if we just said it started in the civil rights movement, that means decades and decades of cultural acceptance of political participation as an important thing. Other communities don't have nearly as long an established history of that, and for that reason don't have organizations that are as have incorporated that into their activities in such a way. It's one of the reasons why we see these differences between communities. Everybody's interested in politics on some level, but there are other differences that explain why turnout is sometimes very different.
Sure. Now, to follow up on this very good point of yours is, so how long does it take a community before they get the numbers, the force, and the grassroots behind them, within them, to really affect votes?
Absolutely. Now, this is the $10 million question that everybody wants to know. How do you go from a community that does not have a political voice to having one? What we typically think of is several electoral cycles where you go from having very few people registered to vote to a large portion registered to vote. And then in the next election, you go from a large portion registered to a large portion voting. And then you get to the point that we just heard about, having actual candidates from the community have a position where they can now step out of as their role as voters or organizers and get to the point of running. And so that's going to take several election cycles. Whether it's 3 or 4 or 5, we really don't know, but it's certainly not just one. It takes often generations to create this kind of environment.
I think another point that has to be made is that the parties are not necessarily too welcoming to new groups.
Even the Democratic Party?
Especially, I would say, the Democratic Party, because, if the African Americans, and to some extent the whites, unlike the Asians and the Hispanics, are much more segregated. So it's easier to draw districts. I do a lot of district drawing. It's easier to draw districts for African American, that are African American than Latino. I mean, for example, the Latinos have a tendency to spread out more, and so do the Asians, than the African American community, largely due, I think, to the fact that the levels of segregation are just much higher among blacks than they are among Asians and Hispanics. And I think the second thing is that if you're a party organization, you don't really necessarily want newcomers. You want, particularly if you're in New York, where you're going to win anyway, why bring in, newcomers? And I mean, there's been, a number of examples.
Is that what you mean by segregation? Because I'm not sure.
No, segregation is housing segregation. Okay. So, for example, the blacks in New York are very heavily segregated. It's, the level of segregation is like, to move the blacks and make them even, they'd have to move like 80% of the blacks to spread them out. Whereas with the Hispanics, it's more like 50%. With the Asians, it's even less. So what happens is that you can build a district that's black, that has African American predominance in it. But also the other point is that if you have a situation where, say, there's an emergence of, say, an Asian, or the emergence of, say, a Hispanic. I mean, I think John Liu's example is a perfect example, because when John initially ran in Queens, he ran against Julia Harrison, and Julia Harrison said very famously, and she was an older Caucasian Jewish woman, said very famously, the Asians have come here to colonize us. And she turned it into an incredibly polarized election. So then term limits kicked in. She was out of office. So the next round, she endorsed John. And John, who had run basically kind of an ethnic campaign, spread out and drew Democrats from, across the district and won. So it's a very complicated game for, I think, particularly for Asians and Hispanics, than compared to African Americans, and as you were saying, African Americans and Caucasians. And in some ways, they have to fight their way in. They have to win like a district leadership, oftentimes against the party. I mean, that was true with Montserrat, before he went kind of crazy. That was true with Lou. This was true with a number of other people who ultimately become part of the power elite. So it's like the establishment doesn't say, oh, gee, there are Asians in town now, we have to bring them in.
Why not? Why not? Why not bring
Well,
them
because
in?
they'll end up with power, and power, I mean, what is politics? Two basic things, power and, jobs and money. And so they'll have to share. Mm-hmm. And so lots of people, base their careers, their pensions and whatnot on, occupying office. So why should they let newcomers in?
Okay, thank you. We're due for our first break now, so stay with us. Welcome back. I'm talking to Drs. Andrew Beveridge and Heath Brown about the city's ethnic and immigrant voters. Dr. Brown, let's start with you on this question. NYU Wagner School Graduate School of Public Service reports claim that Latino turnout at the polls has not increased in the last 20 years despite massive outreach. Why do they seem to be failing, despite the fact that for the last 20 years we've been hearing about the growing political clout of Latinos in New York City?
Yeah, I guess I'd say I agree and disagree with what you just said. I agree that there has been these expectations of change. Change is slow, change is hard. But the actual effort to get Hispanic and Latino voters to register and vote, I think, is not nearly as thorough as we might be led to believe. Okay. There's data that suggests that close to 6 in 10 Hispanic and Latino voters nationwide don't get contacted to vote. That's pretty considerable. So we're not talking about everyone getting a phone call, getting contact. And so I think that the political parties haven't been nearly as eager, and we were just talking about this, haven't been nearly as eager as opening up the process of participation as we might think. But I think more important than that, it takes time for institutions to build. Building institutions necessary to raise the money, get the people trained and the expertise needed to do the complexities of politics takes time, and it's often much slower than we would like. For that reason, it could take decades to go from a realization that a community could have political power to the community actually having political power, because things have to be built, and building is slow. And so I think for the Hispanic and Latino community, what we see is the institutions slowly starting to professionalize, and once they professionalize, slowly getting to the point where they can effectively target voters. It just doesn't happen in one election cycle. Do you agree with that, Dr. Beveridge?
Yeah, I think so, and I also think that there is, as I was mentioning before, that the parties are not quite as enthusiastic about new people. I remember very well being on a long conference call, huge conference call, when they were trying to redistrict California. And in California, what happened was they passed this resolution where they had an honest-to-God, nonpartisan redistricting commission. And I was on a conference call with the Democrats, and we should talk about the Democrats, and they were appalled at this, at this new redistricting commission. They're looking at various ways to block it. And the outcome was they were unable to block it. And the outcome was that because of the redistricting in California, they ended up with a veto-proof majority in the House and the Senate of California. And with Garry Brown, they were able to do massive things. California is now booming. It has, it has running a budget surplus, and basically it pulled it out of like a slough of despond. And secondarily, there were many more Democrats now in both houses, but they were different Democrats. And so you cannot underestimate the interest. I mean, a very well-known political consultant, Norm Adler, once said to me, there's only one issue in politics: incumbency. Everything else is, is that. And if you think about bringing in new groups, what you're talking about is eroding the incumbency of the current groups.
Well, is that the same way nationally? Are we seeing the same trends that we've been talking about locally, what's happening in New York, but on a national level? Do these parties have to safeguard the same narrow interests?
Well, I think there's such a great point, because one of the things we also know over the last couple of cycles is there have been numerous efforts to try to make it more difficult to vote. Voter ID is just one example of that people might know about, where in some places you have to now have a specific kind of ID to show up and vote. It's made it harder for some communities, particularly low-income voters, African-American voters, younger voters, to actually vote. But this has also been targeted organizations, and those efforts have made it much more difficult for a nonprofit organization, a community organization in a state like Florida to go out and simply register voters. Barriers have been placed in front of people from participating, and those barriers have some of the exact impact that they were intended to have, which is to make it more difficult to vote. In the name of protecting the country from voter fraud, it has become an impediment to certain communities turning out and vote, and it has harmed full participation in elections.
Well, so what does this mean for a sort of national two-party system for an immigrant, for a new voter? I mean, is that person sort of like out of the margins politically, or will be for a while, based on the scenarios that we were talking about?
Yeah, years ago, decades ago, Ed Koch said, if you don't vote, you don't count. He said this very controversially, but there's a grain of truth here. Communities that don't come out and vote aren't going to be listened to. Elected officials listen when people vote. I think it's for this reason that communities have to look inside themselves for the efforts needed to turn out. To rely simply on one of the two major political parties to come out and ask people to participate is just not a good idea. You have to look at yourself, look at the community, and say, if we want a voice, we have to do it ourselves, and push your way into the political process, not simply wait until you're pulled in. I think it's that kind of very aggressive, assertive political activity that will take immigrants from the margins and move them to the center of elections in New York or really anywhere.
I think for the presidential, though, I think you're going to have with the Democrats, they're going to reach out because of the big data approaches that they're using to find and bring in voters to the polls. But that will just be for the presidential cycle. Mm-hmm. And what that does at the local and state level is unclear.
Well, who now, based on your scenario, what communities need to do, what communities you think are in the precipice of pushing their way through that power structure?
Yeah, I mean, just look at Queens. I mean, look at our own city and groups like Minquan Center in Queens that has been for decades providing the most essential social services you can imagine, education services, the basics of life. But increasingly, they're seeing political participation as important. They do this in a nonpartisan way. They have no affiliations with the major political parties, but they recognize that their community, primarily Korean Americans living in Queens, need a political voice. I think that's one example just here in the city of a community that has said, we want to participate and we're not going to wait until either of the political parties invite us to. We're going to do it. We're going to make the phone calls. We're going to go door to door knocking. It's going to be something that we take control of so that we can have the political power that we like. And they do it all.
And how have they been doing this? What are they doing? Give us.
They range from what everybody expects, which is a knock on the door that says, are you registered? Are you going to vote? All the way up to very sophisticated processes with digital technology to do phone banking in a way that is as sophisticated as anywhere in the country. So it runs a real range from what basic volunteers can do. Anyone can go and help people turn out to vote. You simply knock on the door and explain your story, to the very sophisticated computer-based work that all sorts of organizations are doing now.
Same question, Dr. Beveridge.
Well, I think that's really one of the major things to do, is to try to get them out. I know that I always tell people when I go to various groups and community groups, I always tell them to register and vote. And they look like, they say, well, what are we going to do about poverty? What are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? And I said, well, number one, register and vote. I mean, I agree with Mayor Koch. If you don't vote, you don't count. And politicians are, not really that good at math, but they're very good at counting. And so, they count up to 1 plus 50. And I mean, that's the truth. The truth of the matter is that if they're concerned, if they endorse someone else, they get really nervous, politicians. I've seen them. 3 or 4 phone calls from voters will actually have a huge effect. So I think that that's what they need to do.
Good. Stay tuned. When we come back, some final thoughts from our guest. Thanks for staying tuned to a special on New York City's ethnic and immigrant voters. Gentlemen, there's a trend among Indian American activists, political activists, and sort of like buying their ways to these breakfasts and dinners as a way to wield influence. Is that a smart way to go about it, Dr. Brown?
Money matters in politics, and so I'm not surprised that there are some communities that say, if we can put the money together to support a political action committee, we can gain influence through our financial resources. I can imagine that happening, but one of the things I think we don't know is whether campaign contributions necessarily lead to the kind of influence that people want. That connection is much more blurry than we're sometimes led to believe. I don't think that it replaces the day-to-day ground effort to make a community broadly participate. Another reason that I think that this may be a dubious strategy is if we're going to take that strategy, you're likely to see the interests of only some members of the community be participating. Communities are vast, and the problems that stretch across immigrant groups aren't only those problems of those with enough money to give to a campaign. And so I think what we want to see is really groups doing everything, including participating in campaign finance, but also doing the very ground level stuff of getting people out. I think it's the broad-based strategy that makes most sense.
Dr. Beveridge?
I completely agree with that. And if you get on the voting roll, you probably will start getting literature. I mean, that's the point. Because once you're on the voting roll, they're going to worry about you, particularly if the election is contested. In New York City, of course, that often means Democratic primaries.
Mm-hmm. Well, nationally, how significant will the ethnic immigrant vote be at a time when, a lot of immigrant communities feel under assault from, we'll just say we haven't named any name now from Donald Trump.
No, I think you're exactly right. It's one of the things that I worry most about is that the tone of this campaign is going to have a demobilizing effect on the exact communities that we might worry most about. If that happens, this will truly be a disastrous electoral cycle. On the other hand, if communities see this as a call to action and see the kinds of threats that you've described, rather than as to demobilize the community, but as a call to say this is the election that we are going to turn out and participate. If that's the impact, well, then there could be a silver lining to what's currently a very dismal political campaign.
Well, it's like, how likely is that? Where, immigrant groups will be mobilized and be fired up, ready to vote?
Well, there's some evidence that particularly the Latino groups are mobilizing for this particular election. And there are certain states which are in play now that probably wouldn't have been in play had there not been a large infusion of the Latinos, particularly Georgia.
And Nevada also.
No, well, Nevada has been in play for a while, but Georgia's like newly sort of in play.
That was surprising because outside of Atlanta, it's very deeply conservative red state.
Well, but there are an awful lot of Hispanics have moved on into Atlanta and along that corridor in Atlanta, and that started a number of years ago. And I think that I just watched something where it's like the number 7th or 8th most populous state with Latinos. So that could very likely turn. If that turned Georgia, that would be a great achievement. And then also there's a constant view that Texas should go blue.
Why is that? Why would Texas of all places go blue?
Because it has so many Latinos. If you get them on the rolls and they vote, I'd say that's possible in the 20s, in 2020, 2023, 24, because that's like, and if Texas turned blue, And
Well-
that's what they have to, but you have to do the kinds of things that you've been talking about.
Well, and in addition to that, a state like Texas, though the numbers aren't large, if you look at a city like Houston, with its increasing Asian American community,
Sure.
particularly
Vietnamese,
its Vietnamese
yes.
American community, a community who has not been as clear in their partisan preferences. This isn't, it's not, this demographics is not destiny in the way that we sometimes think. There are communities out there that have not participated that much in the past, that are looking to figure out what their political identity is going to be. I don't think it's a decided fact that immigrants are always going to very closely affiliate themselves with one party or another. It really takes very robust conversations within the community about what their priorities are, but also a variety of candidates saying, this is something that we want to cater to. That conversation in this cycle has happened differently between the parties, but I think in the future we could see a city like Houston, Texas looking very different because of some communities we don't typically think about.
Where else are we seeing similar trend where the immigrant vote is likely to change the political map?
Arizona, Utah. I think
Utah.
Yeah, I
Explain
mean,
that to
I
me.
think if you take a look at what's going on with Trump, he's doing really well in non-immigrant places, kind of Rust Belt, where there are a lot of whites. He's not doing as well in areas where there are lots of immigrants. And I think part of that is that the immigrants are voting, or the immigrant, their immigrant children are voting perhaps. And part of it is that the people who live there are not as averse to immigrants as people who might live in areas where there are no immigrants.
Explain Utah to me, because that's still pretty much a white state, and even if there's some Latino or Asian migration there,
Well, no, there are a lot of
large
Latinos in Utah because
Really?
they do the work. They do they're the gardeners,
Okay.
work in the restaurants.
But those are not your voters yet, though.
Well, some are and some aren't. I mean, you have to realize that over time they'll have kids. The kids will grow up. They'll be voters. I mean, the proportion of Latinos that are now citizen voting age has gone up. So just because of aging. And so I don't see it as a big, I think that the demographics are shifting in that direction. And that's why they think Texas may go blue.
We're assuming that the immigrants automatically vote Democratic. But, a lot of immigrants, I'm an son of immigrant, I'm an immigrant, are very conservative. And they could espouse some of these values of the Republican Party if they would even try. Why isn't the Republican Party making a play for immigrant voters?
Yeah, well,
At the
just
bottom?
look to Florida. I mean, Florida is the perfect case. I think Florida tells the fascinating story of immigrant politics.
Yes.
From the changing political identity of Cuban Americans in the southern part of the state to the Caribbean community that is just is in large numbers just north of Miami to around Orlando, where you have
large Puerto Rican.
absolutely fascinating changing demographics, and the immigrant community, I think, in Florida is where everyone should pay a lot of attention to, because exactly what you described, the predictability that we sometimes assume is just not the case in a state like Florida, a state that is booming in terms of population and certainly is going to be important in this election. Marco Rubio being a perfect case of a Republican candidate who has been able to gain the support of his own community in the past. Will he continue to do that in 2016? Will that pull along other Republicans? It's hard to know, but if you want to pay attention to just one state, Florida would be the place to do
So
it.
basically, Florida is becoming the bellwether state that Ohio once was.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think you have to realize that once the immigrants, particularly the second generation, understand the position that the Republicans kind of have at this point of kind of exclusionary towards immigrants, towards blacks, towards women, and on and on and on, there is a huge shift. I mean, I noticed recently that there was a poll that showed, like, I think 70% of the Asians now are going Democrat. That was not true 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the default Asians were kind of Republican.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, gentlemen. That's a special look at the city's ethnic and immigrant voting bloc this week. Thanks to my guests, Drs. Andrew Beveridge and Dr. Heath Brown. Till next time, be independent-minded.